Thank you, Andrew. Anyone else hoping for that fire alarm, or just me? When we think about geography, what we learnt at school, what you believe you know, it often invokes a number of ideas. Capital cities, mountains, silkreete, or rocks, glaciers, and even perhaps other places, but rarely sexualities, and certainly not sexualities here. There are a lot of people who've been surprised with my institutional and disciplinary placing. When I work with them on lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer issues, they find it incongruous that I'm a geographer in the School of Environment and Technology. Shouldn't I be in social policy, sociology, or even health? Or those who know me as a geographer in the College of Life, Health and Physical Sciences find it weird that my focus is geographies of sexualities and gender identities, or more shockingly, queer geographies. Incredulity often leads to the question that a good friend likes to ask me: what about Oxbow Lakes? So what has geography got to do with it? Geography is important to me professionally, politically, and personally. Indeed, geography was integral to my coming out. The first remotely lesbian or gay book I brought home to Cork in Ireland from Loughborough University was Mapping Desire. It was Christmas of 1996 when it was on my reading list for Sarah Holloway's third-year Feminist Geographies module, which showed me that gender and sexuality are a key point of geographical inquiry. I loved that book and I read it cover to cover, but I hid it under my pillow in that trip to Cork. In the UK, New Labour were about to get into power, but Section 28, legislation that prohibited the promotion of homosexuality, was in full swing. There was no employment protections around sexuality or gender identity. The age of consent was different for straight and gay people. There were very few role models on TV. Ellen was about to come out and promptly lose her TV show. And academic writing was replete with the experiences of heteronormative discriminations. And this is a word you're going to need for the presentation. So heteronormativity is the normalization of heterosexuality and gender within the understanding that men and women are biologically and socially opposite, meant to come together within monogamous coupled relationships. So the academic writing was replete with experiences of heteronormative discriminations, prejudices, as well as queer resistances. I hid Mapping Desire in part because of what I learned from it. The chapter on home in that book discussed rejection from families. My undergraduate dissertation on women's football gave me a taste for research, and my plans to be a PE teacher gave way to the opportunity to do an MA in Social and Cultural Geographies at Sheffield University with the Jill Valentine. My master's years was eventful, but perhaps the most personally significant moment was when my mother rang. "Catherine, there's a letter here from Sheffield University. Will I open it?" "Sure." "It says there's an interlibrary loan for you. Ready for you. Lesbian Lives. What are you doing with a book called Lesbian Lifestyles?" "It's just for my course, Mum. It's nothing. It's nothing." This shows where time-space compartmentalization fails. In the 1990s, theories of time-space compartmentalization and closet spaces were key ways in which sexualities geographies were discussed. It dealt with how where you are and at what time matters to how you express and live your sexual life. Sexual identities were and are shown in some spaces at certain times, like nightclubs and pubs, or on university courses, but concealed in other places at other times, like straight homes or at work. Time and place matters for who one can be, and who we are changes at different times and in different places. It is also clear that heteronormative people have very different experiences of space-time compared to those of us who were, and are, considered abnormal, an abomination, and may be subject to abuse and violence in relation to this, what Phil Hubbard called moral geographies. From this literature, it became clear that being a lesbian was not going to be easy, but simultaneously it was tantalizing and exciting. In this talk, I hope to share some of my passion for geographies of sexualities and queer geographies as they are refracted through my research, to persuade you that geography matters, not only to understanding sexual and gendered lives, but as key components of our politics. After a note on methods, I'm going to look at public toilets. Moving from the intimate and personal space, I will discuss the experiences and politics of the gay capital of the UK. I then turned to Ireland to look at those who are resisting LGBT equalities and legislative reform around same-sex marriage, before finishing with a transnational engagement with contemporary sexual and gendered politics. So firstly, a note on methods. I am a geographer, said the old gentleman. What's a geographer? A geographer is a scholar who knows the location of all the seas, the rivers, the cities, the mountains and the deserts. Just to be clear, we don't. He cast a quick look around him at the geographer's planet. Never before had he seen such a magnificent planet. Your planet is very beautiful. Are there any oceans? I have no way of knowing, said the geographer. But you are a geographer. Exactly, said the geographer, but I am not an explorer. The geographer is far too important to waste his time browsing around. He never leaves his office. But he receives explorers, he questions them, and notes down what they recall of their travels. The tone of The Little Prince, whereby the geographer is too busy to get their hands dirty and not wasting time, is an apt stereotype of traditional academic research. The University of Brighton and its Community University Partnership project has been at the forefront of challenging these ways of working and crucial for the development of my work. I say my work, but much of what I will present is more accurately characterised as our work. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the people who I've worked with. Sally Munt, Andrew Yip, amazing activists through my research, Count Me Into, the Trans Needs Assessment, Livable Lives, constantly remind me exactly where my expertise lies. More than this, and in presenting this lecture, in celebrating my work, I want to acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of many. Those who have gone before me, those who work with me, and those whose stories created the possibility of each insight. I acknowledge my very privileged position in standing here, and I want to use that privilege to make a difference. And our work will always follow the model of nothing for us without us. I hope that many in this room and beyond will continue to do the honour of working with me. So what has geography got to do with sexed bodies? Geographers and many others do not usually investigate the place of the toilet, but it is a crucial element of our everyday lives. Public toilets are more often than not divided into the sex binaries of man or woman. You must choose who you are as you enter. For many, this is common sense, but forcing people into the sexes of man or woman and genders of male and female has been problematised for decades. Following Judith Butler, it's generally agreed that genders and sexualities are performative. That means there is nothing inherent to who we are. Indeed, we are what we do, and we do who we are over and over again, to make it seem as though this is natural. Geographers since the early 1990s have shown how place plays a key role in these doings. Of course, we know that toilets do not have to be sexed into man or woman. In home spaces, they rarely are. Increasingly, institutions such as this one, we see all-gender toilets, and that's the one that is just outside the door here, testifying to the ways in which fixed gender bifurcated spaces can be contested. Nonetheless, restoring the natural order of heterosexuality, and specifically the opposition of man or woman meant to come together through heterosexuality, can occur in part through the policing of toilet spaces. This policing is often violent for those who don't conform. Trans people, for example, are often subject to abuse both in these spaces and through state-sponsored violence, such as the North Carolina bathroom bill, where people must use the toilets of the sex they were named at as birth. There are also implications for those who are not trans, but whose bodily presentation moves beyond gender norms. In this case, women who are mistaken for men. Do you get mistaken for a bloke often?
Every single day. I can't use public toilets, and I've been thrown out of clubs. 3 bouncers came in and chucked me out of the club. I can't use service station toilets. I've had an old woman batter me out of toilets before. They just look at my build, and look at my height, and look at my haircut, and they just instantly assume that I'm some dirty man in the women's toilets.
In 2005, I used the term genderism to understand when there is a dissonance between how you understand yourself and how you are read, with resulting negative consequences. What's clear from this work is that the place of toilets are important, not as a context or a case study, but as a social relation in itself. This contention reflames explorations of everyday lives by not only accounting for, but also taking seriously the ways in which place plays a part in who we are. It reconstitutes our lives and politics, and in this context, our sexed bodies. The early 21st century saw far-reaching and unprecedented legislative change in the UK that made some argue that lesbians, gay men, bisexual and trans people are now inhabiting a world that we have won. Legislative protections came into place for sexual orientation and gender identity against, for example, employment discrimination and prejudice in the delivery of goods or services. Place is important in understanding how these changes are lived. The Count Me In Two project, with activists like Arthur Law and Leela Bakshi, LGBT people, service providers, Jason Lim and Nick McGlynn and others, explored Brighton, a key city in which LGBT people were supposedly in place and included in the gay capital. A place where LGBT, or at least gay, identity politics are supposed to have been successful in establishing a community that is heard and listened to under the banner LGBT. Here, LGBT people are believed to be part of the fabric of the city. It's supposedly a city paved with gay gold. However,
people are drawn to Brighton because of the perception that there's a gay community here. They think the streets are paved with gay gold, and they quickly learn that that's not the case.
Peter's views were evidenced in the Count Me In Two data. For example, 73% of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people had experienced some form of hate crime in the 5 years prior to the research relating to their gender and sexual identity. And for those who might say this research was undertaken in 2006, in 2014, the Trans Community Needs Assessment undertaken with Switchboard found that only 14% said that they hadn't experienced any sort of crime or abuse in the last 5 years, confirming that for hate crime, or that for trans people at the very least, hate crime remains very common. In terms of mental health, 1 in 5 people did not have mental health issues. That means 4 out of 5 people describe themselves as having some form of mental health issue. Homelessness amongst LGBT people in the Count Me In Two research was much higher than national averages. So if you look at the top two on the far right-hand side, you'll see it was around 22% of people who had experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. During the research period, house prices and rental prices in Brighton were rising steadily. This was set in a context of low wages in the city and a high proportion of accommodation in the private rented sector, with relatively low provision of social housing. This problem is exasperated for younger unemployed people and created a crisis of homelessness in the city. Jackie's account eloquently emphasises the importance of place as a social factor that creates the material conditions of everyday life.
LGBT people who migrate to Brighton and Hove and don't have a housing solution are running enormous risks because statutory services are not set up to help them, and community sector services are also not set up to help them. So you have got a uniquely dangerous situation because of the expense of the private rented sector and the way that housing benefit doesn't give young people any equal stake in benefits. There's also this other stuff around what happened to those people before they came here. What was so painful about their family life, or their home life, or their school life that they fled without anywhere to come to? What drives people to just sleep in the park after Pride and never go home? What drove the person that propositioned me at like 3 o'clock in the morning after Pride last year, myself and my partner, someone who's like maybe 14 or 15 years old? He asked us whether we wanted to have sex with him and how much we would pay. What's he running from? What's he frightened of? Why can't he go home?
Jackie's narrative illustrates the multiple ways in which place interacts with individuals' life trajectories and experiences. The place imaginings of Brighton as paved with gay gold contradicted with the materialities offered by the city to LGBT people who migrate without housing solutions to a city that they see as home. More than this, exclusion was not always easily identifiable. It was and is part of the fabric of the city.
Oppression is like a soup that you're sitting in. It is in your eyes and your nose. It is everywhere. So it isn't something you can say, well, that person did that thing to me. You can identify those events, but they are like the carrots in the soup. They're like the big bits that you can grab hold of and say, well, I was walking along the level and someone hit me over the head without provocation and then proceeded to racially abuse me. That is a hunk of carrot or leek or whatever that's in the soup, but the rest of the soup is there all the time. That is actually what life is like when you're a woman, you are lesbian, you are Asian, you are Muslim, you are all of those things that I am. I think in Brighton there is a kind of naivety. Oh, we are all very nice in Brighton and therefore we don't discriminate against anybody. I think that's a problem. There is a kind of naive collusion with the institutional and other forms of what is soupy oppression, which people don't really recognise.
Yasmin argued for an understanding of the insidiousness of oppression, where some LGBT people did not experience a world that has been won. In her discussion of intersectionalities, including sexuality, gender, ethnicity and religion, and experiences of the gay city, there were multiple and intersecting ways in which some LGBT people continue to experience marginalisation. And the research pointed to how this happened within mainstream as well as LGBT communities and spaces. For Yasmin, assumptions about Brighton's tolerance, lack of discrimination and niceness was a form of naive collusion, one that failed to recognise the ways in which the city perpetuates a soupy oppression. And yet, because of Brighton's image as the gay capital of the UK, the city was seen as well placed to deal with discrimination against LGBT people. As these issues were identified through Count Me In Two and other research like Catherine Johnson's work with Mind Out on suicide, there was a shared understanding that something could and should be done to address them. Conceptualising the LGBT community as having an influence can lead to high expectations.
I think fundamentally most of us have a kind of high expectation of what can happen because we're living in Brighton and Hove. I think most of us believe that if it can't happen in Brighton and Hove, where can it?
Leela Bakshi and I, writing Ordinary in Brighton, argues that the city created conditions for LGBT politics which could push for change because Brighton is supposed to be better. The sexual and gendered politics of the gay city were intricately linked to its geographical imaginings as better than other places, even when it failed, and indeed because it failed to provide for LGBT people. The effects of presuming that we have won due to legislative change are far-reaching. The supposition that there is nothing to fight against, that we are now equal. However, in work with Catherine Nash and Andrew Gorman-Murray, we argue that there's a need to be aware of heteroactivists, and again another word, those who are working to maintain the natural order, in their terms, of man-woman heterosexual relationships in state law and cultural practices. So we argue that there is a need to be aware of heteroactivists who contend that their lost heterosexual privilege and exceptionalism is a detrimental to society as a whole. Whereas in the 1990s, Section 28 in the UK saw same-sex families as pretended and homosexuality as morally wrong and dangerous to children, by the time of the same-sex marriage debate in 2013, these images and arguments no longer held sway. We found that in the same-sex marriage debate in the UK, heteroactivists shifted their arguments away from the moral dangers of homosexuality in favour of positions that sought to remove accusations of homophobia. They did this in a number of ways, including, and this is true, they said that they accepted civil partnerships, but they wanted to maintain the special place of opposite-sex marriage. Here I want to focus on Ireland, taking us from the city to the national context during the same-sex marriage referendum. So on the 22nd of May, and after a bitter campaign, Ireland voted to back the change in the constitution that made marriage genderless. And you can see it was quite a convoluted question. There was no yes, no, like you have in Brexit. Do you approve of the proposal to amend the Constitution contained in the undermentioned bill? The proposal amendment would alter the constitutional statement on marriage to read, marriage can be contracted in accordance with law by two persons without distinction as to their sex, so creating it as genderless as sexless. 61% of the electorate voted, and it voted through with 62%, but the people I'm interested in are these 734,300 people. Ireland was the first country to hold a national referendum on same-sex marriage. Those who opposed same-sex marriage took a number of tacks to persuade people to vote no to the constitutional change. One key tactic was an argument that focused on the so-called needs of Ireland's children. These at times placed a very specific focus on the potential presence or absence of a mother, set in opposition to the idea of two men raising children. Children made motherless by design and with the support of the state. This tactical focus is unsurprising. Given the place of the Irish mammy in Irish culture and the place of Irish women in the home, which is inscribed into the Constitution. And the Constitution, to this day, reads, "The state recognises that by her life within the home, the woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. The state shall therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of duties in their home." The Irish mother in the home then is one to be defended, as she is seen as providing the common good, which is a key trope used by those who resist LGBTQ equalities to place family, marriage and child rearing into heteronormative coupledom. In creating the possibility of a genderless marriage, those who oppose same-sex marriage, and this is key, it did not affect the legal rights relating to surrogacy or parental rights. Nevertheless, their core argument rested on the conflation of marriage with the heterosexual family created with and for biological children. To illustrate how these arguments took shape, I will look at one Vote No poster placed on the streets of Ireland in the run-up to the referendum vote. The poster depicts a child holding a small hand in her mouth, looking down with a contemplative, perhaps unhappy expression. Wavy hair frames the face. The white skin, the slight red tinge to the child's hair, and the clothes chosen indicate a recognisable Irish history and heritage, rendering them one of our children. It's not just the figure of a child that is important. This image lays claim to the figure of a particular Irish child, whose innocence and safety must be protected by suitable adults. The figure of the Irish child helps claim the territory of protector of the nation's children, moving beyond one child to all children. It is shameless in creating a notion of a future that is dependent on the right vote, one that could damage generations to come. It is a call not just for now, but for a white Irish future, where children are protected by society through appropriate parental relations. The title, Surrogacy, as the opening gambit, is used to conjure up the alternative figure to the innocent child, that of the predatory man, or in this case, gay men, looking to exploit vulnerable women in order to bear their children. As Mulhall notes, the debate and the ways in which the media sought to address the issues of bias and balance gave a forum to bigoted comments and debating points in ways that set up what she termed fantasies that populated the mediascape and seeped out into the general populace, suddenly abuzz with the spectres of gay men stalking the streets in search of vulnerable women from whom to harvest eggs and or rent wombs. Surrogacy then is used here to indicate these spectres as a shorthand to point to two male parents, what they lack as well as the dangers they pose. Given that men cannot biologically reproduce without access to eggs and uteruses, this suggests the complete unnaturalness of surrogacy, as well as a lack of genetic links to the resulting child, supposedly so key in creating heteronormative families. This was an element of the debate in Ireland that raised core issues in terms of traditional, and read heteronormative and procreative, versus modern families, and indeed traditional versus modern Ireland. Questioning the naturalness of same-sex relationships is not new in resisting LGBTQ equalities and has been the core argument against all forms of legalisation. Yet the focus on natural procreation and genetics seeks to move away from the labelling of unnatural desires and immoralities that no longer hold sway in certain contexts, like modern Ireland. The question mark after surrogacy indicates a question, a choice, as if surrogacy can be stopped if the right route is taken in the referendum. When linked to the predatory gay man looking not only for eggs but also to fulfil paedophilic desires, it creates an imperative to vote no in order to avoid a particular image of surrogacy. Although, and again just to reiterate, the vote had no direct relationship to surrogacy, parenting or any rights in that relation. The text, "She needs a mother for life, not just for 9 months," neatly encapsulates many of the core arguments against equalities. And I'm going to take each phrase in turn to show how genders, sexualities and nations are reframed in order to produce heteronorms. So she is a female child, apparently more vulnerable than a male child, one that hints at a future mother as well as a current child. The futurity develops from the child into generations that follow and can be reproduced properly and effectively through proper genetic parenting. The needs implores an impulse to protect, to provide for her, to cater for her needs. It seeks to reiterate the need for a specific family form. This is not a choice, it's something she must have. She needs it. But it is not just she that needs it. The broader nation, embodied through the child, needs this vote. And as a consequence, so does the common good. Mother. The use of the singular here is important and points to the inadequacy of lesbian parenting. She doesn't need mothers, she needs a mother. Lesbian parenting and lesbian mothers were rarely mentioned, but when our children are seen as searching for a father figure in Danish sperm banks. The focus on finding real genetic parentage in other places is important, the implication being that these children are only half Irish and not really or fully of the nation. For life evokes a commitment. The ideal of the mother is clear, but so is the mother-daughter relationship. This relationship is idealized and lasts a lifetime as a perfect, loving relationship that's key to success and happiness. Without this lifetime, it is a tragedy that can only lead to individual problems, but also broader societal issues. The not just indicates that from conception, a woman is a mother, indeed the mother. The needs of the fetus are equated to the needs of the child, biological needs interchangeably associated with social needs and the broader social good. The genetic and social firmly established as the best for children and the best for society. For 9 months, the link to the womb and the uterus as women's bodies is clear, returning a woman to her embodiment and linking this directly with her social role as mother. Breaking this link is an affront to the natural order, so favoured in these discourses, where sexed bodies, gender-normative social roles and heterosexual relationships provide the necessary foundations for society. The society founded not just in the figure of the mother, but also her messy embodiment as a pregnant woman who gives birth and then raises the next generation. Finally, the vote no, with the heart in the O, indicating love. When located in this poster, it indicates a very specific form of love, a love for the figure of the child, for the children of Ireland who need protection. Locating the heart in the vote rather than the no refuses a negativity that might associate this with children and their future. Seeking hope in the vote makes it a vote made with love and for heteronormative love. It's also a vote for the common good of society, a common good that rejects surrogacy and two-father families. It's a common good that also creates the same, racially, sexually and in gendered terms, invoking moral societal debates. In this way, this poster invokes discourses that can be traced in the UK, Canada and Australia, but in ways that are specifically Irish. These arguments seek to bring to the fore specific national imaginaries of gender and sexualities as rooted in a white Irish motherhood. They also point to the way in which heteroactivisms are reconstructed through nations and national imaginaries and indicate the ways in which the fights regarding sexual and gender liberations that are seen to be won may well not be so. The work and losses of heteroactivists in contexts like Ireland and the UK and Australia contrast with places such as India, where the natural place of heterosexuality has been rewritten into the law. In India, Article 377 of the Indian Penal Code criminalises carnal intercourse against the order of nature. This article has its origins in 1860s British colonial law. It was read down by the Delhi High Court in July 2009, but in December of 2013, the court reversed the 2009 judgment, reinstating the criminalisation of carnal intercourse against the order of nature. This was the same year that the Marriage Act passed in England and in Wales. Working with Niharika Banerjee and the amazing activists from Sappho for Equality, Leela Bakshi and Nick McGlynn, as well as many others, we have sought to challenge some of the conclusions that might be drawn from this legislative run-through. Namely, the comparison between the UK and India, mainly the comparison between the UK and India that places politics there, where they are losing, and us here as sorted and winning. Legislation is partial and generally an unhelpful measure of livabilities for LGBTQ people. Throughout the Livable Lives research project, we have found that LGBTQ friendliness measures are problematic and exist mainly in discussions of homophobia. And that even where equalities legislations exist, such as the UK, they are not always implemented. So LGBTQ work is not universal or ubiquitous across England, and conversely, in India, Penal Code 377 is not always used. Yet in the data from the research, it was clear that legislation is a part of what makes life livable, and legislative norms do have an importance.
If you are unwell, then what keeps you so?
On a personal level, I am not unwell. On a political level, I am really unwell. Political and social saffronization is not letting me stay well. Gender discriminating social structure is also not letting me stay well. And 377. I think my sexual orientation is not something I will talk about with everybody, and neither will I want to hide it. So actually, maybe 377 is not something that waits beside my bed, but the fear is still there. That I am being forced to be something. I am pushed to carry something heavy. This pressure, these norms, are what keeps me unwell.
For a number of participants from West Bengal, the political situation of Penal Code 377, the broader right-wing government, issues of gender discrimination, as well as the fear of being pushed to carry something heavy, impact livability, or what keeps them well. However, the danger of creating comparisons between India and the UK is that in the UK, other places with less legislation can be used as a reason to say that our lives here are livable. As Count Me In 2 showed, even in the gay capital of the UK, assumptions of livable lives for all LGBTQ people are problematic. Where measures of homophobia or LGBT friendliness pertain to legislative protections, broader cultural changes, as well as individuals' experiences of sexual and gender discriminations, can be overlooked. So one person wrote, straight people often think that as LGBTQ people, we are equal since same-sex marriage, but there is a lot more to it. And Susan said,
legal things changing. People can think that everything is okay just because people are married, obviously. But you're living next door to a bigot or someone who thinks it's disgusting. The issues still remain for people.
As many academics have argued, and what we found in relation to Brighton, changing legislation does not necessarily change LGBTQ people's lives for the better. In Susan's words, issues remain. Indeed, positive legislation for all may result in normative violence for some. A new order can be created such that some who were once sexual and gender dissidents are now part of this new normal, leaving others who remain anti-normative and are potentially more vulnerable because LGBT people are now seemingly equal in the eyes of the law.
This so-called progress that we make in time, I feel like it's always to the detriment of other people. So gay marriage is great, and I'm really happy it exists in some places. But what about people who don't want to get married and who don't fit that also monogamous way of living, the nuclear family, as the one place in society that remains indestructible? And what does it mean if you actually consider your family a social sphere that is broader than actually the nuclear family? Then how do you make your life livable that way? In social change activism, you actually push for things, but I know that by pushing some things, I'm actually acting for the detriment of other people. It's like you're othering people by creating yourself or your group or your community as acceptable, and yeah, I find it really hard to accept.
Marissa and others in the UK noted the same-sex marriage legislation was core to supposed societal acceptance for some. Their happiness about its existence in some places was tempered against the ways in which it reconstructed normative coupled family relations, as Eleanor Wilkinson's work attests. This data points to the complexity of legislative inclusions, which are deeply desired and fought for in India, but do not lead to a utopia or necessarily livable lives in the UK. The normalisations inherent in legislation, such as same-sex marriage, can be read as a victory, but as has long been argued, these victories need to be sceptically, and as Kath Browne and others have argued, geographically assessed. What our data points to is how transnationally LGBTQ people, regardless of legislative contexts, continue to be subject of humiliating and difficult experiences, often seemingly brushed off as a joke.
There is homophobia in totally different ways, like at work. I always feel the need now to go into work and you're like, hi, how are you? I'm like, hi, I'm a lesbian. Let's just do that really quickly, because then it's just out there then, and then the banter can commence, where I will happily join in taking the piss out of myself, because it's easier than being like, please don't offend me, because that's really hurtful. Like I had a manager, a professional manager, referred to me always, never mind my name, but always as Leza. And I laughed at that. Like, yeah, Leza, fine, cool. But then I look back at that and I'm like, that's not fine. That's really not fine. That type of homophobia absolutely exists. As one person, you are vulnerable. You go along with it because you're like, I don't know how to challenge this in a way we don't come across as angry lesbian. You just don't want to be a stereotype because people automatically think if you start ranting,
Oh, angry lesbian, man hater.
At my workspace, my sexuality, because I've never been very shh about it. They are very. It has turned into a kind of private joke sometimes. Like sometimes everybody is okay. You're like this, very good, we are very supportive, we are like this, supportive people. But suddenly, some below the belt jokes and you know they are about you. At that point, you feel very hurt. So if you have to say something, if you have any opinion, say that on my face instead of cracking some private joke. It's hurtful, it's very insensitive, it's uneducated, and I absolutely get very furious about it.
These quotes invoke Yasmin's soup, things that you are immersed in such that you may not notice. Indeed, you can presume them to be acceptance. But being the butt of the joke, whether you are involved or not, can have damaging effects. The idea of sexual or gender identity as part of the joke indicates how these differences continue to be seen. In spaces where people are ostensibly supportive, there continues to be an issue with who is ridiculed and how. There is a need to recognise and name these marginalisations, to find new ways of talking about ongoing experiences of being othered, and recognising the moments and places of oppressions, discrimination and exclusion. Whilst legislation is important, the assumption that equalities legislations make countries better or worse needs to be reconsidered, along with the assumption that in places like the UK, all LGBTQ lives are now livable. Moving beyond the lack or exclusions of certain LGBTQ people to considering how we might think about more than legislative inclusion enables us to work more effectively in transnational ways. Transnational work is not about comparing nations, finding them to be progressive or backward, but instead seeks to question the often post-colonial positioning of nation-states. Disrupting the global north, global south divide intervenes into debates that hierarchize Western democracies as spaces of inclusion, vilifying exotic others as inherently homophobic and synonymous with backwards. These theoretical engagements are juxtaposed with the ways in which seeing somewhere as worse than where you are can be empowering. Your life is not as bad as it might be. And in the questionnaires, somebody said, when we asked them what makes your life not livable, not much when I consider the hurt and pain LGBTs undergo on a daily basis in other countries. The hurt and pain of others seemingly dwarfs the hurt and pain that might otherwise be recognised and agitated around. I am fine because they are not. This is replicated in Brighton Pride and other places to create a specific form of LGBTQ politics. LGBTQ politics that becomes synonymous with pointing out legislation and state-sponsored violence elsewhere. If everything is sorted here, there are no problems to be addressed. The united feature then becomes our support for them elsewhere. This can ask LGBT people here to overlook and get over their issues, concerns and experiences, and things that make their lives not livable. It's not broader social issues that are at stake because these issues are worse elsewhere. So ongoing discriminations and marginalisations are to be ignored in favour of those poor others in other places. And this was evident in the data as well. As an LGBT person, are there specific places where your life is not livable? India is pretty high on the list, as is the Middle East, many parts of Africa, large swathes of East Asia, or simply Africa. In the India data, there was a similar move to see elsewhere as worse than here. In this case, in terms of urban and rural divides.
I think it's because we are in a city we can live like this. In the film, it was a village, and obviously there was not enough awareness and education, because of which there was so much problem.
There are problems with basing politics on other places and other people who need help and work, and us who are educated and can live like this. Not only can it obscure and downplay key issues around sexual and gender identities here, ignoring the soup of everyday lives, it can fragment communities such that there is only a focus on the intersectional other. When heteronormative concerns and problems are no longer valid, the problem becomes the person with a problem. This can further marginalise and exclude, individualising problems to specific groups, such as trans people, or particular individuals, such as those with mental health issues. These issues are, of course, crucial and central to our communities, but they are not the problem of others who fail. The problem is broader heteronormative orders that we are all subject to. This order is the unease that many of us continue to feel, that the world has not been won, but But it, and what is it, is difficult to name and often negated for other places that are worse. We need to investigate the continued disenfranchisement of LGBTQ people through things like health, hate crime, and microaggressions like being the butt of the joke. Incidents that might be shrugged off, but can have lasting consequences. The placing of the problem elsewhere is often set in a post-colonial frame that does not acknowledge, for example, in the Indian context, the place of colonialism in creating legislation such as Penal Code 377. In doing so, it creates victims who are marginalised and in need of global North interventions to save them. That was not what our research pointed to, and this frame ignores how LGBTQ people find space to be themselves for expression, creation, and community. Finding places can be empowering, and indeed there is a need to be powerful. Life isn't always livable for LGBTQ people. I decided to look up what the definition of a professor is, and alongside professing in an area, it's also a person who affirms a faith or allegiance to something, which I've shown for me is geography. Toilet spaces make us men and women. Cities co-construct our sexual and gender politics. National imaginaries remake how LGBTQ legislative advances are contested, and geographical imaginings of others elsewhere define our contemporary lives, our struggles, and our politics. Place matters to who belongs and to who doesn't. It creates layers of inclusion and exclusion. And this will be felt in years to come as we confront the most pressing issue and the most geographical issue of our times, Brexit. It's clear that nation, identity, sense of place, transnationalism, globalisation and sovereignty mean that we cannot understand Brexit without a recourse to geography. There is little doubt that the loss of EU membership will have significant ramifications for all of us in our everyday lives, and the places we inhabit and no longer perhaps belong to. The materialities are yet to be realised, and indeed we continue to fight for what form this may take. The fight is not won, or indeed lost. It is no revelation that those who are precarious are more likely to suffer the negative social, cultural and the negative effects of social, cultural and economic change. Those who are on benefits, who are integrated into families and communities, but who do not get married or formalise legal family ties in order to protect themselves from the backlash of coming out in their country of birth, are precarious in terms of remaining in and belonging to Britain. They will not inherit the world we have won. There can be little doubt that the negative effects of Brexit will be hardest felt by those already marginal in LGBT communities and beyond. The post-Brexit cultural fallout around racism and xenophobia will affect LGBTQ people of colour and those who are not British. Moreover, the effects of Brexit in a globalised world will move beyond the UK. Understanding the transnational effects on LGBTQ people is going to be crucial. There can be little doubt that the privilege of whiteness, middle class, marriage and other dominant and normative identities may protect some of us. EU migrants who could lose their leave to remain are unlikely to be white, middle class professors who have legal protections in place. And still it is important to recognise that not all LGBTQ people are safe, even if ostensibly certain rights and protections remain in place. Those of us who enjoy the privilege of class, race and other social advantages will be affected by the ramifications of this decision. After Brexit was announced, one measure of reporting homophobic hate crime went up 147%. And those who were in their terms against gay marriage were quick to point out that David Cameron's decision to push through same-sex marriage was to blame. He had to appease the far right of his party. The EU was also imposing on British sovereignty in introducing this legislation. So this is Robert Oscar Lopez is one of the key agitators in this. The perfect storm gathered throughout 2013 and 2014. While we hear a great deal about immigration as a driving issue behind the Brexit UKIP right in the United Kingdom, one must note that angst over immigration had existed for a long time. The marriage debacle was, on the contrary, fresh and new. The redefinition of marriage was commonly viewed as something imposed by the European Union. We need to continue to study those who now feel disenfranchised, whose heteronormative privilege has been challenged and questioned. They are seeking to recuperate a particular version of family and society. There is much to be done to explore the dual trends of the limits of LGBTQ livabilities and how these new normals are being opposed by these heteroactivists. Some of this is best served by working in transnational ways, in ways that are different from current namings of homophobic other places. The possibility of working transnationally to address hate, prejudices, and the many things that make life not livable for LGBTQ people can be taken without seeking cultural sameness, and in ways that eschew hierarchies of place. Specifically maintaining a cultural awareness of activisms and politics that are built on seeing some places as better than others, which are read and imagined as backwards and behind. These will be well served by processes that involve communities and refuse to seek and represent victimhood in contrast with freedom. Moving beyond hierarchical comparisons or parallels questions the idea that those in privileged positions in the global north have all the answers, that we are dealing with poor others that need saving. Let me be very clear. The global north has not got it right. We have not won, and we should not be dictating to others how to make sexual and gender liberations possible. Instead, we can and should seek to work with others in non-hierarchical ways and spaces, ways that displace global north privileges, opening up possibilities for new learning, new activisms, and new lives. Thank you. You will see outside that I've listed a huge number of people who I am absolutely indebted to. I don't separate the personal and professional in this. What I've achieved is all of our achievements, and I wouldn't be here without the support and guidance and generosity of my family, and Mum and Dad, who took Joe's not a boy, Joe's a girl very well, showing that my life might be different to the critical purview of many academic texts. I wouldn't be here without friends that are family and the many people I work with in various guises. I hope that you'll celebrate with me, that you celebrate our work and the recognition that this award bestows. Before I introduce Deborah, I want to thank her and the University of Brighton for putting inclusivity and livable lives as central to the new university strategy. There is much to look forward to at the University of Brighton. So I have to read these words. May I now present Professor Deborah Humphreys, Vice-Chancellor of the University, to conclude proceedings.